The champagne glass slipped from my fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of my daughter's pristine kitchen. Rebecca's voice cut through the elegant chatter of her housewarming party like a blade through silk. "Dad's just irrelevant now," she announced to her circle of perfectly coiffed friends, her laugh sharp and dismissive. "Some people age out of usefulness, you know. Time moves on, but some people just don't." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The room went silent except for the soft classical music drifting from hidden speakers. I stood there, Harold Mitchell, 78 years old, gripping the granite countertop as my daughter's words echoed in the cathedral ceiling of her McMansion. Her friends nodded knowingly, their Botoxed faces arranged in sympathetic smiles. Poor Rebecca, their expressions seemed to say, stuck with such a burden. The humiliation started 3 hours earlier when I arrived at Rebecca's new home in Riverside's exclusive Meadowbrook neighborhood. The house was a monument to modern excess, all glass walls and angular lines, rising like a corporate headquarters from its manicured lot. I'd driven my 10-year-old Honda Civic past the parade of luxury SUVs and German sedans lining the circular driveway, my modest vehicle looking like a lost tourist in a foreign land. Rebecca had greeted me at the door with the kind of hug that barely made contact, her designer dress rustling as she pulled away quickly. "Dad, you made it," she said, her tone suggesting she'd hoped otherwise. Behind her, Trevor lounged against the foyer's marble columns, his tech entrepreneur uniform of expensive jeans and casual blazer, doing little to hide his perpetual sneer. My son-in-law had perfected the art of looking through me rather than at me, as if I were merely furniture that happened to speak. The party was a showcase of Rebecca's new social circle, Hartford County's rising elite mixing martinis and networking cards with equal enthusiasm. I'd watched from the periphery as she introduced her guests, each title more impressive than the last. District attorneys, hedge fund managers, pharmaceutical executives, and tech moguls filled her open-concept living space, their conversations a symphony of stock options and political connections. When Rebecca had finally remembered to introduce me, her words carried the weight of embarrassment. "This is my father, Harold. He's retired." The way she said "retired" made it sound like a terminal diagnosis, her voice dropping as if she were announcing a shameful family secret. Trevor had chimed in with his own poison. "Hal here represents the old guard, don't you, Hal? Back when things were simpler." His emphasis on simpler dripped with condescension, transforming my 70 decades of life into something quaint and obsolete. I'd retreated to the kitchen, seeking refuge among the catered spread and hoping to avoid further humiliation. The granite island was laden with delicacies that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Truffle-topped canapés and imported cheeses, arranged like tiny monuments to excess. I'd picked up a champagne flute, more for something to hold than any desire to drink, and found myself trapped as Rebecca held court near the wine refrigerator. Her voice had grown louder with each glass of wine, her inhibitions dissolving along with her filter. "I mean, what's the point of dwelling on the past?" she'd proclaimed to her audience of admirers. "My generation is actually making things happen. We're building the future while some people are stuck reminiscing about glory days that probably weren't even that glorious."
The champagne glass had slipped then, its destruction marking the moment my patience finally shattered along with it. Rebecca barely glanced at the mess, her attention already moving to the next topic of conversation. "Maggie will clean that up," she said dismissively, referring to the catering staff as if they were invisible servants rather than people. The woman she'd casually named happened to be arranging flowers nearby, an older woman with kind eyes who caught my gaze and offered a sympathetic smile. Something about her seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where we might have met. I excused myself, mumbling something about getting air, and stepped onto Rebecca's expansive deck. The view stretched across perfectly manicured lawns toward the Connecticut River, the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. It should have been peaceful, But all I could hear was my daughter's laughter drifting through the open doors, punctuated by Trevor's booming voice as he regaled the guests with stories of his latest startup acquisition. Standing there in the cooling evening air, I felt the weight of every sacrifice I'd made for Rebecca's future pressing down on my shoulders. The long nights spent helping her with homework while my own career demanded attention, the college tuition that had stretched my budget to its breaking point, the quiet pride I'd felt watching her graduate, start her career, build what I'd thought was a successful life. Now it seemed that success had come with a price, her respect for the man who'd helped make it possible. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text for my grandson Tyler. "Grandpa, sorry about Mom tonight. She gets weird at these parties. Want to grab breakfast tomorrow?" The message was a small comfort, proof that not all of Rebecca's family had forgotten basic human decency. Tyler, at 16, seemed to possess more emotional intelligence than his mother had displayed in years. I watched through the glass doors as Rebecca continued to entertain her guests, her animated gestures and sparkling smile masking the cruelty that had become second nature. She'd learned to weaponize charm, to disguise her dismissal of others as sophisticated humor. When had my little girl, the one who used to crawl into my lap for bedtime stories, become this polished stranger who found my existence embarrassing? The irony wasn't lost on me that Rebecca had built her life around appearances and connections, yet she remained completely blind to the connections that had shaped her own existence. She saw only what she wanted to see, an aging father whose relevance had expired, a relic from a simpler time who served no purpose in her carefully curated world. What she didn't know, what she'd never bothered to learn, was that the man she'd dismissed so casually had once moved in circles that would make her current social climbing look like child's play. As I prepared to leave, slipping quietly through the side gate to avoid another round of condescending farewells, I caught sight of the catering woman again. She was packing up near the service entrance, and something about her careful movements triggered a memory. Margaret O'Brien, though she'd aged since our last meeting nearly a decade ago. Maggie had been chief of staff to Governor Patricia Hayes back when I'd served in the state Senate, our paths crossing countless times in the halls of the Capitol building. Our eyes met across the parking area, and recognition dawned on her face as well. She approached with the same confident stride I remembered from committee meetings and legislative sessions, though her current uniform of black pants and white shirt was a far cry from the power suits she'd worn in Hartford. "Harold Mitchell," she said quietly, her voice carrying the warmth of old friendship, mixed with the awkwardness of our current circumstances. "I thought that was you in there." "Maggie," I replied, surprised by how good it felt to be recognized, truly seen, after hours of being treated like living furniture. "What brings you to the catering business?" Her smile was rueful. "Consulting dried up after Patricia left office. This pays the bills and keeps me busy."
She glanced back toward the house, where Rebecca's party continued in full swing. "That's your daughter in there?" I nodded, unsure how to explain the evening's humiliation without sounding bitter. Maggie seemed to understand anyway, her expression softening with sympathy. "Family can be complicated," she said simply, "especially when they don't know who you really are." Her words hit closer to home than she probably realized. Rebecca truly didn't know who I was beyond the simplified narrative she'd constructed. Retired father, burden from the past, irrelevant old man taking up space in her successful world. She'd never asked about my years in the legislature, never wondered about the bills that bore my name or the committees I'd chaired. In her mind, my life had begun when she was born and ended when she'd moved out. Everything else just background noise to her starring role. As I drove home through Riverside's quiet streets, past the country club where I'd once debated policy with future governors and current congressmen, I felt something stirring that I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just anger at Rebecca's cruelty, though that certainly burned in my chest.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
It was something more dangerous and more powerful, the awakening of instincts I'd thought were buried with my political career. My modest ranch house on Elm Street looked smaller than usual after an evening in Rebecca's glass palace, but it felt like sanctuary. Inside, the walls were lined with books rather than expensive art, and framed photographs told the story of a life lived in service rather than pursuit of status. There, tucked between pictures of Rebecca's childhood milestones and Tyler's baseball games, hung a photo most visitors never noticed: Governor Patricia Hayes and me at the signing of the Education Modernization Act, the legislation that had transformed Connecticut's public school system and secured funding for programs that still served thousands of students today. Rebecca called my life irrelevant, but she had no idea that children across the state were still benefiting from laws I'd helped craft. She dismissed my past as ancient history, unaware that the governor she'd probably voted for twice owed significant portions of her legislative success to groundwork I'd laid during my 22 years in the state Senate. My daughter thought she was building the future, but she was standing on foundations I'd helped pour. The phone sat silent on my kitchen table, but I could imagine the calls I could make, the doors that would still open at the mention of my name. Patricia Hayes still held the governor's mansion, and our friendship hadn't dimmed with my retirement. Former colleagues had moved on to judgeships, federal positions, and corporate boardrooms, but the relationships we'd forged in the crucible of state politics remained strong. Rebecca wanted to play social climbing games, measuring worth by connections and influence. She had no idea that her irrelevant father could outplay her at her own game without breaking a sweat. The question wasn't whether I could remind her who she was dealing with, it was whether I should. The man who'd spent decades building coalitions and navigating complex political waters hadn't disappeared just because he'd retired from public office. He'd simply been waiting, dormant, for a reason to return. As I sat in my quiet kitchen, surrounded by the modest comforts of a life well lived, I realized Rebecca had given me that reason. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, and my daughter was about to learn that relevance isn't determined by age or current position. It's built on a lifetime of relationships, achievements, and the quiet power that comes from having actually changed the world. The morning sun filtered through my kitchen blinds as I sat with my coffee, the steam rising from the mug like ghosts of old memories. Sleep had been elusive after Rebecca's party, my mind churning with fragments of conversations and the sting of her dismissal. The house felt different in the daylight, charged with possibility rather than the quiet resignation that had settled over it in recent years.
My study beckoned from down the hallway, a room I'd avoided for months. Inside, dust motes danced in the sunbeams that slanted across my old oak desk, illuminating stacks of papers and files I hadn't touched since retirement. The walls were lined with volumes of legislative records, policy briefs, and committee reports that chronicled 2 decades of public service. Rebecca had never shown interest in this room, dismissing it as Dad's boring office filled with ancient history. I pulled open the bottom drawer of my desk, its contents a testament to a life spent in the corridors of power. Business cards yellowed with age, handwritten notes from colleagues, and invitations to state dinners gathered dust alongside photographs from bill signings and campaign events. My fingers found what they were seeking, a worn leather address book that had traveled with me through countless legislative sessions and political campaigns. The names inside represented a network built over 22 years of public service, relationships forged in the crucible of policy debates and late-night committee meetings. Senator Patricia Hayes, now Governor Hayes, occupied the first page, her contact information updated in my careful script as she'd climbed the political ladder. Below her, federal judges, congressmen, state officials, and business leaders filled the pages with phone numbers and addresses that could open doors Rebecca never imagined existed. I flipped through the pages slowly, each name triggering memories of bills passed, crises navigated, and coalitions built. Here was Federal Judge Thomas Crawford,
who still owed me a favor from when I'd shepherded his son's scholarship application through the state system. There was Congressman William Pierce, my former colleague who'd moved from Hartford to Washington and never forgotten the mentor who'd guided his early career. These weren't just names in a book. They were living connections to a world Rebecca believed I'd never inhabited. The irony wasn't lost on me that my daughter had built her career in marketing, selling products and ideas to people who might never use them, while I'd spent decades actually shaping the policies that governed their lives. She measured success in quarterly earnings and social media followers, but I'd measured it in legislation that improved education funding, protected environmental resources, and strengthened worker protections. Her influence extended to corporate boardrooms and country club gatherings, but mine had reached into the daily lives of every Connecticut resident. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Patricia's private number, the one reserved for personal calls rather than official business. My thumb hovered over the dial button as doubt crept in. It had been nearly 2 years since we'd spoken. Our last conversation, a brief exchange of pleasantries at Eleanor Hartwell's funeral. Would she remember our friendship, or had time and the demands of office eroded the bond we'd shared during our legislative years? The phone rang twice before her familiar voice answered, warm and slightly amused. "Harold Mitchell, as I live and breathe. I was wondering when you'd finally call." Her laughter carried through the phone, dispelling my fears about forgotten friendships. "I've been waiting for you to get bored with retirement and come back to cause some trouble." "Patricia?" I said, surprised by how natural it felt to fall back into old patterns of conversation. "I wasn't sure you have time for a call from a has-been politician." "Has-been?" Her tone sharpened with mock indignation. "The man who wrote the Education Modernization Act doesn't get to call himself a has-been. Do you know how many times I've referenced your work in speeches? Half my education policy is built on foundations you laid." We talked for nearly an hour, catching up on family news and political developments with the easy familiarity of old friends. Patricia filled me in on current legislative battles, budget negotiations, and the ongoing challenges of governing in an increasingly polarized environment. I found myself offering insights and suggestions, my political instincts awakening after years of dormancy.
"You know," Patricia said as our conversation wound down, "I've got a charity gala next weekend. The Connecticut Education Foundation is honoring legislative champions who've made lasting impacts on public education. Your name came up more than once during planning discussions." She paused, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in her mind. "Any chance you'd be interested in attending? I could use someone with your institutional knowledge to help work the room." The invitation was casual, almost offhanded, but I recognized the opportunity it represented. The Connecticut Education Foundation's annual gala was one of the state's premier political and social events, drawing everyone from federal officials to corporate CEOs. Rebecca had probably never heard of it, but her marketing colleagues would recognize its significance immediately. More importantly, it would be a chance to reconnect with the community that had defined my professional life. "I'd be honored," I said, meaning it more than Patricia could know. "Should I expect the usual suspects?" "Oh, you know how these things go. Every power broker in the state will be there, plus a few from Washington. Senator Collins is flying in from D.C., and I think Judge Morrison is coming down from Boston. The business community will be well represented too. Tech executives, pharmaceutical leaders, the usual crowd." Her voice carried a hint of conspiracy. "Between you and me, I could use some help managing certain personalities, corporate types who think they understand education policy because they attended private schools." After hanging up, I sat in my study for a long time, the address book open on my desk like a map of possibilities. The man Rebecca had dismissed as irrelevant was being personally invited by the governor of Connecticut to attend one of the state's most exclusive events. The daughter who'd built her identity around connections and networking had no idea that her father could walk into rooms she'd never be invited to enter.
I spent the rest of the morning researching the Education Foundation Gala online, reading about previous year's events and notable attendees. The guest list read like a who's who of Connecticut's political and business elite, exactly the kind of gathering Rebecca would kill to attend. Photos from past events showed Governor Hayes presenting awards to education advocates, business leaders cutting checks for scholarship funds, and politicians posing with university presidents and school superintendents. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. "Grandpa, still want to grab breakfast? Mom's in a mood this morning." The message reminded me that Rebecca's cruelty wasn't just personal. It was affecting her son's relationship with his family. Tyler had grown up hearing dismissive comments about his grandfather, absorbing the message that age equaled irrelevance and that past achievements meant nothing in today's world. I drove to meet Tyler at Brewster's Cafe on Main Street, a local institution that had survived decades of chain competition through the simple expedient of serving excellent coffee and treating customers like neighbors. Tyler was already waiting in a corner booth, his lanky frame folded over a cup of hot chocolate, his expression troubled in the way that only teenagers could manage. "She was really awful last night, wasn't she?" he said without preamble, his directness cutting through any attempt at small talk. "The stuff she said about you being irrelevant and everything, it was embarrassing." I slid into the booth across from him, studying my grandson's face for signs of the cruelty that seemed to run in his mother's generation. Instead, I saw something that gave me hope. Genuine concern and the kind of moral clarity that suggested Rebecca hadn't completely poisoned his perspective. "Your mother is under a lot of stress," I said carefully, not wanting to burden him with adult conflicts. "Sometimes people say things they don't mean when they're trying to impress others." Tyler shook his head, his jaw set with determination that reminded me of Rebecca at that age, before ambition had hardened her heart. "She meant it, Grandpa. She's been saying stuff like that for months. Ever since Dad started making real money with his company, she's been acting like anyone who isn't successful by her standards doesn't matter." We talked for an hour over pancakes and coffee, Tyler sharing stories about his parents' increasing obsession with status and appearances. He described dinner conversations that revolved around networking opportunities and social climbing, family gatherings that felt more like business meetings than actual visits. According to Tyler, Rebecca had become consumed with positioning herself among Riverside's elite, trading authentic relationships for strategic connections. "The weird thing is," Tyler said, stabbing at his remaining pancakes, "she's always talking about important people and powerful connections, but she never asks about your stories. Like, didn't you used to work in government or something? She acts like your whole life was just being her dad." His words hit me with unexpected force. Tyler was 16 years old, and even he could see what Rebecca had missed, that dismissing someone's entire life experience was not just cruel, but foolish. My grandson understood intuitively that wisdom and influence didn't disappear simply because someone had retired from official positions. "I did work in government," I said slowly, weighing how much to reveal. "For more than 20 years, actually. Your grandmother used to joke that I spent more time in Hartford than I did at home." Tyler's eyes widened with interest. "Like, doing what? Important stuff?" For the first time in years, I found myself talking about my political career with someone who genuinely wanted to listen. I told Tyler about late-night committee sessions, about building coalitions across party lines, about the satisfaction of seeing bills become laws that actually improved people's lives. His questions were thoughtful and engaged, revealing an intelligence that Rebecca seemed determined to overlook in her son. "So you actually knew governors and senators and stuff?" Tyler asked, his voice filled with the kind of awe his mother should have shown years ago. "That's incredible, Grandpa. Why doesn't Mom ever talk about this?" I didn't have a good answer for that question, at least not one suitable for sharing with his 16-year-old. The truth was that Rebecca had constructed a narrative about my life that served her emotional needs. I was the simple retiree father whose modest circumstances justified her own pursuit of wealth and status. Acknowledging my political career would have complicated that story, forcing her to confront the possibility that success could be measured in ways other than bank balances and social connections. As we prepared to leave Brewster's, Tyler surprised me with an unexpected request. "Grandpa, would you maybe want to come to my school sometime? We have this career day thing where people talk about their jobs, and most of the parents just talk about boring business stuff. I bet kids would be really interested in hearing about government and making laws and everything." The invitation was simple and innocent, but it sparked an idea that had been forming since my conversation with Patricia. Rebecca dismissed my past as irrelevant ancient history. But what if I stopped hiding that past? What if, instead of quietly enduring her contempt, I reminded the world, and my daughter, exactly who Harold Mitchell had been and still was? Driving home from breakfast, I found myself taking a detour past the Connecticut State Capitol building in Hartford. The golden dome gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its neoclassical columns and marble steps as impressive as they'd been during my first visit as a freshman legislator nearly 3 decades ago. I'd walked those steps thousands of times, carrying bills and amendments, hopes and compromises, the weight of representing constituents who trusted me to make their voices heard. The building looked smaller than I remembered, but that was probably because I'd grown in confidence and understanding during my years of service.
The nervous young man who'd first entered those halls had gradually become someone senators sought out for advice, someone governors consulted on policy matters, someone whose opinion carried weight in rooms where important decisions were made. Rebecca thought she was building something impressive with her marketing career and social climbing, but she was playing in the minor leagues compared to the arena I'd occupied for 2 decades. She measured influence by corporate titles and country club memberships, but I'd wielded the kind of power that actually shaped society, the power to write laws, allocate resources, and determine how institutions would serve the public good. That evening, I returned to my study with renewed purpose. The address book lay open on my desk, its pages offering a roadmap back to relevance. I began making a list of contacts to call, events to attend, and connections to revive. Patricia's gala was just the beginning. There were alumni gatherings, policy conferences, and charitable events that would welcome a former legislator with my track record. Rebecca had thrown down a gauntlet without realizing it, challenging me to prove my relevance in a world she thought she understood. What she didn't know was that while she'd been building her small kingdom of suburban status, I'd spent decades in the real corridors of power. She was about to learn that influence isn't something you lose when you retire. It's something you bank, accumulate, and deploy when the situation demands it. The phone sat silent on my desk, but I could feel the potential energy crackling through its circuits. 22 years of relationships, favors owed and granted, legislation passed and battles won, all of it waiting to be activated with a few strategic calls. Rebecca wanted to play power games, but she had no idea she was challenging someone who'd been playing at a level she couldn't even imagine. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, and my daughter was about to discover that her irrelevant father still had more connections than she could dream of building in a lifetime of networking. The question wasn't whether I could outmaneuver her in the game of influence and status. It was how much of my hand I wanted to reveal in the process. The Connecticut Education Foundation Gala was 3 days away, and I had spent the morning crafting a plan that would showcase exactly how connected Harold Mitchell remained. The irony of using an education event to educate my daughter about respect wasn't lost on me. I sat in my study, reviewing the guest list Patricia had emailed, cross-referencing names with my address book, and marking potential allies with a red pen. Rebecca had always dismissed my interest in education policy as boring government work, but she had no idea that the legislation I'd championed had created scholarship programs that still bore my name. The Hartford Mitchell Education Initiative funded college tuition for underprivileged students across Connecticut, a program that had quietly changed thousands of lives while operating below the radar of social media and celebrity culture that dominated Rebecca's world.
My phone buzzed with a text from Maggie O'Brien. "Harold, heard from Patricia you'll be at the gala. Would love to catch up properly. Can we meet beforehand?" Her message included an address for a coffee shop in Hartford, the kind of place where political operatives had been making deals for decades. Maggie had always been sharp, and I suspected she had information that would prove valuable. The drive to Hartford felt like traveling back in time. Interstate 91 carried me past familiar exits and landmarks that triggered memories of countless trips to the capital. The Connecticut River wound alongside the highway, its surface reflecting autumn clouds that reminded me of campaign seasons and legislative sessions that had stretched deep into winter nights.
Politicians, lobbyists, and journalists had negotiated everything from budget deals to campaign strategies within these paneled walls. She looked more like the Maggie I remembered from our government days. Her silver hair styled professionally, and her sharp business suit replacing the catering uniform from Rebecca's party. "You clean up nicely," I said, sliding into the booth across from her. "I almost didn't recognize you without the serving tray." She laughed, a sound that carried decades of shared experiences in state government. "Catering pays well, but it doesn't feed the soul like good political intrigue. Patricia mentioned you're coming back into circulation. About time, if you ask me." We ordered coffee and fell into the comfortable rhythm of old colleagues sharing information. Maggie filled me in on current political dynamics, budget battles, and personality conflicts that shaped today's legislative landscape. Her insights were invaluable, providing context for names and faces that had changed since my retirement. "There's something else," Maggie said, lowering her voice despite the pub's relative privacy. "Your daughter Rebecca has been making waves in certain circles. Her husband's tech company is seeking state contracts for education software, and she's been using her marketing connections to arrange meetings with school board members." The information hit me like cold water. Rebecca was already operating in the education policy space, trying to leverage her professional network to influence the same system I'd spent decades serving. She was approaching it from the corporate side, seeking profit rather than public benefit, but our paths were crossing in ways she couldn't possibly understand. "How much do you know about their business model?" I asked, keeping my tone casual while my mind raced through implications. Maggie's expression grew serious. "Trevor's company promises revolutionary learning analytics, but their pilot programs have shown mixed results at best. They're heavy on marketing presentations and light on actual educational outcomes. Some district superintendents are asking hard questions about data privacy and student surveillance." The pieces were falling into place with disturbing clarity. While Rebecca had been dismissing my career as irrelevant ancient history, she and Trevor were trying to monetize the very education system I'd helped modernize. They were selling technology solutions to problems they didn't understand, approaching education as a market to exploit rather than a public trust to protect. "What's their timeline?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "They're pushing for contract approvals before the next budget cycle. Rebecca's been scheduling meetings with decision-makers, using her social connections to get FaceTime with people who control purchasing decisions." Maggie paused, studying my expression. "Harold, these people don't know you exist. When Rebecca talks about her family background, she focuses on Trevor's startup success and her own marketing achievements. She's essentially erased your entire career from her personal narrative." The revelation stung, but it also presented an opportunity. Rebecca was operating in my professional sphere while pretending I'd never existed within it. She was building relationships with people who had worked with me for decades, seeking influence in systems I'd helped create, all while maintaining the fiction that her father was just an irrelevant retiree with no meaningful connections. We spent another hour strategizing, with Maggie providing names and contact information for current players in Connecticut's education establishment. Many were former colleagues who would remember my work. Others were newer faces who might know my reputation without knowing my family connections. The network was still there, dormant but intact, waiting for the right moment to be activated. That evening, I began making calls. The conversations followed a similar pattern. Surprised delight at hearing from me, catching up on family news and retirement activities, then gradually steering toward current education policy discussions. Each call reinforced the same message. Harold Mitchell was welcomed back into conversations that mattered. Dr. Sarah Chin, the state's education commissioner, remembered me immediately. "Harold, Patricia mentioned you might be attending the gala. I've been hoping to reconnect with you about some challenges we're facing with education technology contracts. Your expertise would be invaluable." Federal Judge Thomas Crawford invited me to lunch next week. "I never properly thanked you for your help with David's scholarship application. My son's doing brilliantly at Yale Law, by the way. We should discuss some opportunities for you to get involved with our court's educational outreach programs." Congressman William Pierce offered to arrange meetings with key staffers in Washington. "The House Education Committee could use your institutional knowledge, Harold. There's talk of major federal education legislation next session, and your perspective on state implementation would be crucial." Each conversation was a thread, being rewoven into a tapestry of influence that Rebecca had no idea existed. While she was struggling to schedule meetings with mid-level bureaucrats, I was being invited to policy discussions at the highest levels of state and federal government. My phone rang while I was updating my notes from the evening's calls. Tyler's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with genuine warmth. "How's my favorite grandson?" "Grandpa, something weird is happening," Tyler said, his voice carrying teenage bewilderment. "Mom's been on the phone all day trying to get meetings with school people, and she keeps getting transferred to voicemail or told that schedules are full. She's frustrated because apparently people who used to return her calls aren't getting back to her." I felt a smile tugging at my lips. Word was already spreading through Connecticut's tight-knit education community that Harold Mitchell was returning to active engagement. When government officials and education leaders had limited time and unlimited requests for meetings, they prioritized based on relationships and respect. Rebecca was discovering that her marketing credentials carried less weight than she'd assumed in rooms where policy expertise mattered more than promotional campaigns. "Is she upset?" I asked, genuinely curious about my daughter's reaction to encountering resistance. "She's been yelling at Dad about how these people don't understand business opportunities," Tyler said. "She keeps saying they're missing out on innovative solutions, but Dad told her that government moves slowly and she needs to be patient. Then she said something about how if she had better family connections, doors would open faster." The comment was rich with unintended irony. Rebecca was lamenting her lack of family connections while systematically ignoring the family member whose connections could have opened every door she was trying to force. She was struggling to access a network that had welcomed me back with open arms, pursuing influence in a field where my name still carried significant weight. "Tyler, what do you know about your mom's business meetings?" I asked carefully, not wanting to put him in an uncomfortable position, but needing to understand the scope of their activities. "Not much," he admitted, "but she's been preparing these presentations about education technology and data analytics. She practices her pitches on Dad sometimes, talking about revolutionizing learning outcomes and optimizing student performance metrics. It sounds pretty complicated." I listened as Tyler described Rebecca's efforts to position Trevor's company as an innovative disruptor in the education technology space. Her marketing background had taught her to package solutions in compelling language, but she was operating without understanding the regulatory environment, established relationships, and institutional culture that governed education policy decisions. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, superintendent of schools for one of Connecticut's largest districts. "Harold, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. Patricia Hayes gave me your number and suggested I reach out about a situation we're facing." Dr. Walsh explained that several technology companies were aggressively pursuing contracts for student data analytics systems, making promises that seemed too good to be true. School board members were being courted with expensive presentations and promotional events, but the actual educational benefits remained unclear.
She was seeking advice from someone with my experience in evaluating complex policy proposals. There's one company in particular that's been very persistent, Dr. Walsh continued. The marketing representative is quite polished, talks a good game about innovation and disruption, but when we ask for evidence of improved learning outcomes, the data gets fuzzy. They're connected to some influential people in the business community, but they don't seem to understand how public education actually works. I didn't need to ask which company she was describing. Rebecca's aggressive marketing approach was backfiring in an environment where credibility mattered more than salesmanship. Education professionals were trained to evaluate claims critically, to demand evidence rather than accept promotional promises, and to prioritize student welfare over corporate profits. Would you be willing to review their proposal? Dr. Walsh asked. We'd value your perspective on both the policy implications and the implementation challenges. Your work on education modernization gave you insights that would be directly relevant to these technology decisions. I agreed to review the materials, knowing that Rebecca's proposal would soon be sitting on my desk for expert analysis. The situation was developing beyond my most optimistic expectations. My daughter was unknowingly submitting her business strategy to the very person she dismissed as irrelevant, seeking approval from institutions that still valued my judgment above her marketing credentials. That afternoon, I drove to Tyler's school to discuss the career day presentation he'd requested. Lincoln High School was one of the beneficiaries of legislation I'd championed, its programs enhanced by funding formulas I'd helped develop. Walking through hallways filled with students whose educational opportunities had been expanded by my work provided a tangible reminder of why policy mattered more than profit. Principal Martinez greeted me with surprising enthusiasm. "Mr. Mitchell, Tyler mentioned you'd worked in government. I had no idea we had such a distinguished alumnus parent in our community. Your legislation created the dual enrollment program that's sending dozens of our students to college with advanced credits. We'd be honored to have you speak to our students." The Career Day presentation was scheduled for next week, the same day I'd be attending Patricia's gala. The timing was perfect. I'd be able to share my experiences with young people who were benefiting from policies I'd helped create, then spend the evening reconnecting with colleagues who were shaping current education policy. It would be a day that showcased exactly how relevant Harold Mitchell remained in the field Rebecca was trying to enter. As I left the school, I noticed a familiar car in the visitor parking lot. Rebecca's BMW sat empty near the main entrance, its gleaming paint and expensive details standing out among the more modest vehicles of teachers and staff. She was inside the building somewhere, probably attempting to schedule a presentation about Trevor's education technology. I waited in my car, curious to see how her meeting would conclude. 20 minutes later, Rebecca emerged from the building, her expression tight with frustration. She walked quickly to her car, her designer heels clicking against the asphalt with sharp precision.
Even from a distance, I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she fumbled with her keys that suggested the meeting hadn't gone as planned. Her BMW pulled out of the parking lot with unnecessary speed, leaving behind tire marks that seemed to symbolize her growing desperation to make an impact in a field that wasn't responding to her usual tactics. Rebecca was learning that influence couldn't be purchased or marketed into existence. It had to be earned through service, demonstrated through results, and maintained through genuine relationships. I drove home with satisfaction settling over me like a comfortable blanket. The first phase of my plan was working better than I dared hope. Rebecca was struggling to gain traction in precisely the arena where I remained most respected, while her dismissive attitude toward my career was preventing her from accessing the very connections that could have helped her succeed. The irony was perfect and poetic. My daughter had declared me irrelevant in a field where I was still considered essential, had dismissed my experience in an area where she desperately needed guidance, and had burned bridges to relationships that could have opened every door she was trying to force. She was about to learn that relevance isn't determined by current job titles or social media presence. It's built through decades of service and sustained through the respect of people who matter. The Connecticut Education Foundation Gala was tomorrow night, and I intended to make the most of every opportunity it presented. Rebecca thought she understood power and influence, but she was about to receive a masterclass from someone who'd been wielding both long before she'd learned to walk. The morning of the Connecticut Education Foundation Gala dawned crisp and clear, autumn sunlight streaming through my bedroom windows with the promise of revelation. I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to state dinners and bill signings, its fabric still holding the confidence of a man who'd once commanded respect in rooms that mattered. The transformation felt complete as I adjusted my tie in the mirror. Harold Mitchell was no longer the dismissed grandfather from Rebecca's party, but the seasoned statesman returning to his natural environment. My phone had been buzzing since dawn, with messages from old colleagues confirming attendance, dinner invitations extending beyond tonight's event, and policy discussions that would resume where we'd left off years ago. The contrast with Rebecca's recent struggles couldn't have been starker. While she'd been fighting for meetings with mid-level administrators, I was being welcomed back into conversations at the highest levels of state government. Tyler arrived at 10 o'clock sharp for our drive to his school. He'd insisted on introducing me himself rather than letting the principal handle the formalities, a gesture that touched me more than he could know. His excitement was infectious as he chattered about his classmates' reactions to having an actual former state senator visit their career day. "Some kids didn't believe me when I told them my grandfather helped write laws," Tyler said as we drove through Riverside's tree-lined streets. "Jason Martinez said his dad's never heard of you, so you couldn't have been that important. I told him maybe his dad doesn't pay attention to the right things." The comment revealed more than Tyler probably intended. Rebecca's narrative about my irrelevance had apparently spread beyond our immediate family, filtering through social circles where my actual achievements had been forgotten or deliberately obscured. She'd been so successful in diminishing my legacy that even teenagers whose educational opportunities had been shaped by my legislation had no idea who I was. Tyler led me to the auditorium where my presentation was scheduled, passing bulletin boards covered with college preparation materials and scholarship announcements, many of which existed because of funding mechanisms I'd helped establish. Principal Martinez introduced me to the assembled students with genuine enthusiasm. "We're honored to welcome Mr. Harold Mitchell, whose 22 years of service in the Connecticut State Senate helps shape the educational opportunities you enjoy today. The dual enrollment program, the expanded AP offerings, even the technology labs where you work on projects, all of these exist because of legislation Mr. Mitchell championed." The auditorium held about 200 students, their faces reflecting varying degrees of interest and skepticism. I'd spoken to hostile audiences before, lobbied reluctant colleagues, and convinced skeptical voters, but addressing teenagers required a different approach entirely. They demanded authenticity and relevance, dismissing anything that felt like empty political rhetoric. I began with a story about my first day in the legislature, the nervousness and uncertainty that reminded me of starting high school in a new district. The comparison drew knowing nods from students who understood the anxiety of navigating unfamiliar social hierarchies and unwritten rules. From there, I described the process of turning ideas into actual policies, using examples that connected directly to their daily experiences. "How many of you have taken college courses while still in high school?" I asked, watching hands rise throughout the auditorium. That program didn't exist when I was your age. It took 3 years of committee meetings, budget negotiations, and convincing skeptical legislators that high school students were capable of handling college-level work. Now, over 15,000 Connecticut students graduate each year with college credits already completed. The engagement level shifted as students realized I was describing systems that affected their actual lives rather than abstract political concepts. Questions began flowing.
about the legislative process, about balancing competing interests, about how policies moved from proposal to implementation. Their curiosity was genuine and insightful, revealing an understanding of civic engagement that gave me hope for the future. "Mr. Mitchell," asked a senior named Amanda, "how do you deal with people who think your ideas are stupid or outdated?" The question sparked laughter from her classmates, but I recognized the deeper concern behind it. These students were navigating their own challenges with authority figures who dismissed their perspectives, institutions that seemed unresponsive to their needs, and adults who treated their voices as irrelevant. "You build coalitions," I said simply. "You find people who share your goals even if they disagree with your methods. You listen to criticism and separate valid concerns from personal attacks. And sometimes you prove your relevance through results rather than arguments." As the presentation concluded, several students approached with follow-up questions and requests for contact information. Tyler stood beside me with obvious pride, his earlier doubts about his grandfather's importance clearly resolved. Principal Martinez mentioned that the school board would be meeting next week to discuss technology proposals, noting that my insights would be valuable to their deliberations. The timing was perfect and entirely deliberate. Rebecca's proposal for Trevor's education analytics system would be reviewed by the same board members who just heard me speak about effective policy evaluation. They'd be comparing her marketing presentation with my track record of actual educational achievements, weighing corporate promises against proven legislative success. I drove home with time to spare before the evening's gala, feeling energized by the morning's interactions with young people who represented the future of Connecticut's educational system.
The afternoon was reserved for final preparations and a conversation I'd been anticipating since this entire sequence began. Rebecca called at 3 o'clock, her voice tight with frustration that had been building for days. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. Have you been talking to people about Trevor's business?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications she didn't fully understand. I settled into my study chair, surrounded by the books and papers that chronicled a career she'd dismissed as irrelevant, and chose my words carefully. "I've been having conversations about education policy," I said truthfully. "It's a subject I care deeply about, and people sometimes ask for my perspective on current developments." "That's not what I mean, and you know it," Rebecca snapped. "Doors that were opening for us last week are suddenly closed. Meetings that were scheduled are being postponed indefinitely. People who were interested in our proposals are now asking for additional documentation and outside evaluations. Someone's been poisoning the well against us." Her paranoia was revealing more than she intended. Rebecca assumed that opposition to her business plans must result from malicious interference rather than legitimate concerns about their proposals. She couldn't conceive that education professionals might evaluate her company's offerings and find them inadequate based on their own expertise and standards. "Rebecca," I said gently, "perhaps these officials are simply being thorough in their evaluation process. Education decisions affect thousands of students, and responsible administrators take time to consider all implications before committing public resources." "Don't patronize me," she shot back. "I know how business works, and I know when someone's working against me. The question is whether my own father would sabotage his daughter's success out of some petty jealousy about my criticism of your outdated career." The accusation was breathtaking in its audacity and psychological projection. Rebecca was attributing to me the same calculated cruelty she'd displayed at her party, assuming I would weaponize family relationships for personal revenge just as she'd weaponized public humiliation to establish social dominance. "I would never sabotage your legitimate business interests," I said, emphasizing the word legitimate more than strictly necessary. "However, I also won't remain silent when asked to evaluate proposals that might affect educational quality or student welfare." The line went quiet for a long moment.
When Rebecca spoke again, her voice carried a new quality, uncertainty mixed with something that might have been recognition. What exactly are people asking you to evaluate? Technology proposals for student data analytics, I said simply. Several districts are seeking independent perspectives on vendor claims and implementation challenges. My background in education policy makes me a logical person to consult on such matters. I could almost hear Rebecca's mind working through the implications. She was beginning to understand that her father's supposedly irrelevant career had positioned him as exactly the kind of expert whose opinion could make or break her business plans. The man she'd dismissed as outdated was being consulted on the cutting-edge technology she was trying to sell. "You can't be serious," she said finally. "You've been retired for years. What could you possibly know about modern education technology?" "I know how to evaluate vendor claims against student outcomes. I understand the regulatory environment governing student data privacy. I have relationships with the administrators and board members who make purchasing decisions. And I remember what happened the last time districts rushed to adopt unproven technology solutions without proper evaluation." Each point landed like a hammer blow against Rebecca's assumptions about my irrelevance. Her silence stretched longer this time, filled with the sound of worldviews colliding and narratives crumbling.
"This isn't over," she said finally, though her voice lacked the conviction she'd carried earlier in the conversation. The threat felt more like a plea, the desperate assertion of someone who'd realized their opponent held better cards than they'd imagined. After hanging up, I sat in my study for a few minutes, processing the conversation and its implications. Rebecca was finally beginning to understand that dismissing my career had been a strategic error with real consequences. She was discovering that influence doesn't disappear with retirement, that relationships built over decades don't dissolve simply because someone leaves office, and that expertise accumulated through years of service remains valuable long after the formal position ends. The evening's gala would complete her education in these realities. While Rebecca struggled to gain access to education policy circles, I would be dining with the governor, chatting with federal judges, and discussing future legislation with current senators. The contrast between her marginal influence and my central positioning would be impossible to ignore or explain away. I dressed for the gala with the same care I'd once taken preparing for important legislative sessions. The drive to Hartford felt ceremonial, a return journey to the world where Harold Mitchell had never been irrelevant, where his voice still carried weight and his opinion still mattered. The Connecticut Education Foundation had reserved tables for distinguished guests near the front of the ballroom, a seating arrangement that would place me in clear view of anyone who bothered to attend. The Marriott Hartford downtown buzzed with the energy of Connecticut's education and political elite gathering for their annual celebration. Luxury cars lined the valet area, their occupants emerging in evening wear that suggested both affluence and purpose. I recognized faces from news broadcasts and newspaper photos, current office holders who'd built careers on foundations I'd helped establish. Governor Patricia Hayes spotted me immediately upon my arrival, crossing the reception area with the confident stride that had carried her from junior legislator to chief executive. Her embrace was warm and genuine, the greeting of an old friend rather than a political courtesy. "Harold, you look magnificent," she said, stepping back to study my face. "Retirement obviously agrees with you, though I suspect you've been keeping busier than you let on." Before I could respond, we were joined by Congressman William Pierce, Federal Judge Thomas Crawford, and Education Commissioner Sarah Chen. The conversation that followed was exactly what I'd hoped for and Rebecca had feared. A high-level policy discussion among people who shaped educational decisions across Connecticut and beyond. My insights were sought, my opinions valued, and my suggestions taken seriously by officials whose decisions affected hundreds of thousands of students. Harold, we need to get you back into active consultation, Commissioner Chen said as dinner was announced. The federal education legislation coming up next session will require state implementation expertise that you understand better than anyone currently in government. The evening was unfolding perfectly, each conversation reinforcing my position within networks that Rebecca had assumed were closed to me. As we moved to our tables, I noticed several familiar faces from my morning presentation at Lincoln High School. School board members, district administrators, and education advocates filled the ballroom, many of whom had heard my career day presentation just hours earlier. The irony was complete and devastating. While Rebecca fought for meetings with minor officials, I was being recruited for federal policy consultation by people who control billions in education funding. While she struggled to schedule presentations for Trevor's unproven technology, I was being asked to evaluate proposals that would shape educational technology adoption across multiple states.
The formal program began with Patricia taking the podium to welcome guests and introduce the evening's theme of educational innovation and achievement. Her opening remarks included recognition of legislative champions whose work had created lasting improvements in Connecticut's education system. When she mentioned the Hartford-Mitchell Education Initiative and its impact on college accessibility, the sustained applause made clear that my contributions were neither forgotten nor considered irrelevant. As dessert was served, my phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. "Grandpa, Mom's been crying in her office all evening. Dad says she found out you're at some big education event tonight with important people. She keeps saying she didn't know. Hope you're having a good time." The message was confirmation that Rebecca was finally beginning to grasp the magnitude of her miscalculation. The father she'd dismissed as irrelevant was being celebrated by the very institutions she'd been trying to penetrate. The connections she'd assumed didn't exist were being displayed publicly at the state's premier education policy event. Patricia returned to the podium for the evening's final remarks, her words carrying particular significance given the day's revelations about family dynamics and professional recognition. Tonight reminds us that education is built on relationships between teachers and students, between institutions and communities, and between generations of leaders who pass wisdom forward. Some contributions echo through decades, shaping opportunities for young people who will never know the names of those who fought for their futures. We honor that legacy tonight, and we commit to extending it tomorrow. The evening concluded with networking conversations that extended invitations for future collaboration, consulting opportunities, and policy discussions that would continue long after tonight's celebration ended. I exchanged contact information with current officials, accepted speaking invitations from universities, and agreed to participate in education policy conferences that would showcase my expertise to national audiences. Driving home through Hartford's quiet streets, I reflected on the day's dramatic reversal of fortune. This morning, Rebecca had accused me of sabotaging her business interests through jealousy and pettiness. Tonight, she was discovering that her father commanded respect in circles she'd barely imagined existed, wielding influence she'd never recognized, and maintaining relationships that could have opened every door she'd been trying to force. The governor of Connecticut had publicly celebrated my contributions to education policy, while Rebecca's own proposals were being quietly shelved by administrators who questioned their value. The reversal was complete, the lesson delivered with devastating precision, and the message unmistakable. Relevance isn't determined by current job titles or social media presence, but by the lasting impact of a life spent in service to others. Tomorrow would bring new conversations about Rebecca's growing understanding of her father's true position in the world she'd been trying to enter. But tonight belonged to Harold Mitchell, the man who'd never actually lost his influence. He'd simply been waiting for the right moment to remind everyone, including his daughter, exactly who he'd always been. The morning after the gala brought an unexpected visitor to my front door.
Rebecca stood on my modest porch, her usual designer armor replaced by simple jeans and a sweater, her makeup-free face revealing exhaustion and something I hadn't seen in years: vulnerability. She held a coffee cup from Brewster's Cafe, the steam rising between us like a peace offering. "Dad, can we talk?" Her voice lacked the sharp confidence that had defined our recent interactions, replaced by something smaller and more uncertain. "I brought you coffee. Your usual, black with 1 sugar." I stepped aside to let her enter, noting how she moved through my small living room with careful attention to details she'd previously dismissed.
Her eyes lingered on the framed photographs, chronicling my legislative career, the commendations from education organizations, and the thank you letters from teachers whose programs I'd helped fund. The evidence of my professional life had always been visible in this house, but she was seeing it clearly for the first time. We sat across from each other at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd eaten countless solitary meals while she built her impressive life in marketing. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated the lines around her eyes, stress markers that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult realizations. "I've been doing research," Rebecca said quietly, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup for warmth. "About your career, your legislation, the people you worked with. I never knew, Dad. I honestly never knew any of it." The admission hung between us, heavy with implications that went far beyond professional credentials. She was acknowledging not just ignorance about my work, but a fundamental failure to see me as anything more than the narrow role she'd assigned me in her personal narrative. "The Hartford Mitchell Education Initiative has provided college scholarships to over 3,000 students," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she recounted facts she'd learned. "The dual enrollment program Tyler's using exists because of a bill you wrote. The technology standards that companies like Trevor's have to meet were established by legislation you sponsored." I listened without interruption as she detailed the scope of my career achievements, watching her process the disconnect between the father she dismissed and the public servant whose work had shaped her son's educational opportunities. The irony was evident in every sentence. While building her marketing career around selling solutions to problems, she'd ignored the man who'd spent decades actually solving them. "Governor Hayes called me personally yesterday," Rebecca said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "She wanted to discuss Trevor's proposal for the state education technology contract. She said the evaluation committee includes former Senator Harold Mitchell, whose expertise in education policy would be essential for proper assessment." The revelation had clearly shaken her understanding of family dynamics and professional hierarchies. The governor she'd probably voted for twice knew her father personally, sought his counsel on policy matters, and valued his opinion above the marketing presentations Rebecca had crafted. She didn't know we were related until I mentioned it. When she found out, her whole demeanor changed. She started talking about your integrity, your commitment to student welfare over corporate profits, and how rare it was to find someone who couldn't be influenced by political pressure or financial incentives. I watched my daughter wrestle with the implications of Patricia's comments, understanding finally that the standards her father had maintained throughout his career would now be applied to her business proposals. The man she'd dismissed as irrelevant would be evaluating whether her company's promises served student interests or merely corporate ambitions. "Dad, I owe you an apology that goes beyond what I said at the party," Rebecca said, meeting my eyes directly for the first time in months. "I've been so focused on building my own success that I forgot to understand the foundation it was built on. Your sacrifices, your service, the quiet work you did while I was growing up, I dismissed all of it because it didn't fit the narrative I'd created about what success looks like." Her words carried the weight of genuine recognition rather than strategic damage control. This wasn't the practiced apology of someone trying to manipulate a situation to her advantage, but the honest acknowledgement of someone confronting uncomfortable truths about herself. "Tyler helped me understand some things," she continued.
"He told me about your presentation at his school, how excited the students were to learn about actual governance, rather than theoretical business concepts. He said you made policy work sound meaningful rather than boring, that kids were asking follow-up questions and wanting to get involved in local government. The mention of Tyler brought warmth to our conversation, a reminder that our family extended beyond the damaged relationship between Rebecca and me. My grandson had become an unexpected bridge between generations, carrying forward values that connected my public service with his developing understanding of civic responsibility. "I want to withdraw Trevor's proposal from consideration," Rebecca said suddenly, the decision apparently crystallizing as we spoke. "Not because I'm afraid you'll reject it, but because I've realized we were approaching education as a market to exploit rather than a trust to serve. Your questions about student outcomes and data privacy weren't obstacles to overcome. They were the right questions we should have been asking ourselves." The announcement surprised me with its moral clarity and practical wisdom. Rebecca was choosing principle over profit, acknowledging that some opportunities weren't worth pursuing if they compromised values or violated public trust. It was a decision her father would have been proud of, even if it came at considerable financial cost. "What will you do now?" I asked, genuinely curious about her plans and hoping our conversation had opened possibilities for different kinds of success. "I'm thinking about applying my marketing skills to nonprofit work," she said, a small smile emerging for the first time since her arrival. "Education advocacy organizations need people who understand how to communicate policy benefits to diverse audiences. Maybe I could help bridge the gap between the important work people like you do and the public understanding that makes it politically sustainable." The idea represented a fundamental shift in Rebecca's approach to professional fulfillment, moving from selling products to promoting principles, from pursuing personal advancement to supporting public good. It was a career path that would honor both her marketing expertise and the family legacy of service she'd finally recognized. We talked for another hour, sharing stories about Tyler's development, discussing Rebecca's emerging interest in education advocacy, and beginning to repair relationships that had been damaged by years of mutual misunderstanding. She asked questions about my legislative experience with genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation, seeking insights that could inform her transition to meaningful work. "Dad, I want Tyler to understand where he comes from," Rebecca said as our conversation wound down. "Not just the successful grandfather who served in government, but the values that motivated that service. I don't want him making the same mistakes I made about what really matters." The commitment felt like more than family reconciliation. It was a recognition that civic engagement and public service represented worthy aspirations for the next generation. Tyler would grow up understanding that influence could be used to serve others, rather than just advance personal interests. That success could be measured by community impact, rather than individual accumulation. Rebecca stood to leave, our relationship fundamentally altered by honest conversation and mutual recognition. At the door, she paused and looked back at the modest house she'd once seen as evidence of my limited ambitions. Now it appeared to represent something different, the home of someone who'd chosen service over status, principles over profits, and lasting impact over temporary advantage. "I love you, Dad," she said simply. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see who you really are." After she left, I called Tyler to suggest we celebrate his grandmother's birthday next week by visiting her grave together. It was time to tell him more stories about the remarkable woman who'd supported my legislative career while building her own legacy of community service. The woman whose example had shaped both my public work and my private values. The phone rang with another call from Governor Hayes, this time about a federal education policy position that would require someone with my experience and integrity. The opportunity was tempting, a chance to return to active service at the national level, but it could wait until after family matters were properly settled. For now,
It was enough to know that Harold Mitchell had never actually been irrelevant. He'd simply been waiting for the right moment to remind everyone, including his daughter, that true influence comes from serving others rather than serving yourself. The governor definitely agreed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.